I'm Shaun Haney, and this is RealAg on the Weekend. Let's get real and get connected with the week that was in Canadian agriculture. RealAg on the Weekend starts now. Welcome, everybody, to RealAg on the Weekend here on 650 CKOM and 980 CGME. I'm your host, Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture.com. It is great to be with you here on this Saturday and Sunday, and hopefully you're having yourself a great weekend, and you had yourself a great week as we continue to see moisture falling in parts of Saskatchewan. Boy, I'll tell you what, those moisture maps are going to look a lot different than they did 60 days ago, indeed, and I like it. I like it a lot. It's fantastic. I was actually in Saskatoon this week. Wednesday, I was in Saskatoon for a meeting and, of course, stayed at the beautiful Delta Besborough in downtown Saskatchewan. It's fantastic. I love that hotel. Any hotel that still has... I love the fact they've kept some of the history of that hotel. Like, they haven't totally modernized it. Like, the elevator, beside the elevator, they still have where you can put the mail in. The Mail Canada Post drops on the mezzanine level. They've got the phone booth that's still there. Somebody asked me, is that phone booth still working? I'm assuming not. But that kind of stuff is so cool. When you look at that hotel and some of the other CP hotels that we have, the some of the Fairmonts and the Palliser in Calgary as an example, really that's Canadian history in those hotels. And you close your eyes and you just imagine what it was like, people coming in on the train and traveling across the country. They didn't travel. So I take a 1-hour flight from Calgary to Saskatoon on Tuesday night. That wasn't possible at the time where those hotels were first built. So it's pretty cool stuff when you think back historically like that. But hey, let's get to the show and talk about what's on today's program. Okay, so up first, we're going to talk about the meeting in Phoenix, Arizona this week between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. Definitely some trade things to sort out there. I've got a question for you. A part of it is a discussion that I had with my colleagues at Real Agriculture, Lindsay Smith and Kelvin Hepner, talking about if AFC, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Deputy Minister Stephanie Beck was right here in the room, and you had an opportunity to say, here's what I think we need to do to really fix Canadian agriculture, what would you tell her? Lindsay and Kelvin have some thoughts. I put them on the spot on the Real Ag Radio podcast this week. I'm not sure they appreciated it, but it was a lot of fun. And maybe you'll send me some feedback, too, and what your thoughts are as well on that. We've also got a beef market update with Ann Wasko of the Gateway Livestock Exchange. Of course, Ann ranches in East End, Saskatchewan, and I'm sure she's loving some of this moisture. That grass has got to be looking pretty good down in those parts. And then we're going to talk about a really important topic as it applies to the battle against herbicide resistance, and that is herbicide layering. We're going to hear some audio from a recent Pulse School episode that we did at RealAgriculture.com with Sean McKnight of BASF Canada. Now, if you have any feedback on today's program, we would love to hear from you. I want your thoughts, your comments, your questions. Maybe it's a bit of a burr under the saddle, so to speak. You can get a hold of me by sending me an email at shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also find Real Agriculture across all the different social media platforms, or you can call the Real Ag feedback line. That number is 855-776-6147. I mentioned this meeting that happened this week in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was all the trade officials, ministers, secretaries from the trade portfolios from Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Lots to discuss. Now, a part of the USMCA agreement is that they have these regular, I think it's annual, get-togethers to do some legwork and maintenance of the CUSMA USMCA agreement, depending on which country you're in. Some people still call it the new NAFTA. That's fine too. You get the gist. You get the picture. This deal, so critical to Canada. And although there are trade skirmishes from time. And there's always going to be any trade deal. You're going to have some friction. You're going to have a situation where one country says, wait a minute, we don't feel that this is what the agreement said, or you're not following the agreement, or you're not abiding by it, or, hey, there's opportunity that we said this in the text. This is not working because things have changed. So there's all those things to constantly work out. But the reality is that nobody can argue, I don't think, and some will. But inside agriculture, this agreement's critical. It's important to Canada. It's important to Mexico. And it's also important to the United States. And so we're going to hear about the fact that whether Mexico wants or doesn't want GM white corn out of the U.S., we're going to hear the U.S. say, wait a minute, we don't like the way that Canada is handling the tariff rate quotas on dairy, and it's preventing U.S. product from getting into the country like it was supposed to. We're not happy about that. Canada's got some issues too with how at times they feel, softwood lumber is, being attacked or things like that. But it's kind of interesting, and there's the communiques that come out, right, on here's what was discussed, and that tells you a story. But there's also what's not, what hasn't been said, and all this is happening at a time where the Biden administration is ramping up their tariffs on some Chinese goods. And so obviously that's a real fascinating issue because some of those tariffs are exactly what the Trump administration was doing. And now the Biden administration is doing the same. And so the trade policy between the Biden administration and the Trump, it's kind of looking sort of the same. There's some parallels there, indeed. Now, Catherine Tai, the current USTR, worked under the former USTR, Robert Lighthizer, so we probably shouldn't be too surprised by that. I would expect, I would hope, I would be disappointed if it was not brought up. Canada being in that meeting and really emphasizing the point, it is fine to use these sorts of tariffs on China. We get why you're doing it. In fact, Canada, last week, Trade Minister Ng was talking about how, they are also doing their own investigation in terms of the requirements for potential tariffs on Chinese EVs. The same as what the U.S. is doing. And she referred to our friends to the south. So Canada clearly choosing a side on this issue, and in my mind, choosing the right side on this issue. That's all fine. But trying to remind everybody in that room in Phoenix, wherever they met, at some very, very nice hotel in Scottsdale, saying, do not take that same tact, U.S., and treat Canada and Mexico with that same sort of brush. Don't paint us with the same brush. Don't use those same kind of tariffs on your North American trade partners, Canada and Mexico. I would hope that was a discussion in the room. My opinion has not changed on this. I remember being in Saskatoon at an event and telling farmers about this and other speaking events that I did across the country throughout the winter. I think these three countries, although they're not going to agree on everything, need to be functioning more in unison and really leveraging each other and the integration of the economies and the integration of the value chains to really, really push forward as the rest of the world goes very multilateral, Canada versus China, and protectionism becomes more and more of a thing. I hope that's what Canada was trying to say in that room. Time will tell if that is how the reality turns out. But if you have any thoughts on that, of course, you can always send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Now, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to play some audio from the RealAg Radio podcast, and I want you to ponder this question too. If AFC Deputy Minister Stephanie Beck was in the room, and she said, okay, what would he need to do in Canadian agriculture? What would you tell her? We'll talk about that when we come back. You're listening to RealAg on the Weekend here on 980 CGME, and of course, 650 CKOM.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
There's a reason we call it the Corn School. Videos on everything from planter setup to weed control, field trial results, and the latest yield strategies. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from RealAgriculture.com, or as a podcast in your favorite podcast app. Check out the latest Corn School episode today.
Join the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association at their AGM June 9th to 11th in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. Registration is now open. Visit skstockgrowers.com for more information and to register.
So on Friday's edition of the Real Ag Radio podcast, I put the question to our panelists, Kelvin Hepner and Lindsay Smith of RealAgriculture.com. If the AFC Deputy Minister Stephanie Beck, or, well, you could even say, hey, if Lawrence Macaulay, the Minister of Agriculture, was sitting in the room with you, and you had the opportunity for an ask, or maybe it's a tell, in terms of ways to significantly improve and enhance the industry of agriculture, and that could be nationally, and things that actually also impact your region, your province. So in this case, we'll say Saskatchewan. What would that be? And so I surprised the panelists with this question. Here's what they had. Here's the conversation. This is from Friday's Real Ag Radio podcast, and then I got some thoughts as well.
So I don't know. Picking one thing isn't fair. I could go with the angle of respecting what is possible, what we're capable of. That I feel like as an industry, we often sort of are fighting for being recognized as having the potential and actually believing in the sector enough to see it through, and something along that conversation of like, I don't know. I think as an industry, we talk a lot about, what agriculture already contributes to the GDP. Is there room to do more? Like that there's all this potential. Okay, that's great. So, I guess we start there. But then the second part is, how do we achieve that potential? And I really wonder, would there be a way to communicate that we have to have this lens of achieving that potential being put on the policies and the programs we're going to put out? That somewhere we have to actually be thinking about the action items that get us to achieving that potential, not just talking about what the potential is.
It's kind of like, referring to the Barton Report all the time, but actually not doing the Barton Report.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good one. Kelvin, here we go.
I'm having a tough time coming up with a specific thing, but I would say, so there are some examples though that come to mind, and my general advice would probably be focus on public goods. And that's a general in terms of what's the role of government. Focus on public goods that the private market isn't investing in. So infrastructure for export would be one of those major areas. Focus on the things that equip all the private businesses, including every farm across Canada, for success. So export infrastructure would be one. Trade, market access would be another one. Investment in technology and research in areas where private stakeholders don't have the same incentive to invest that broader economy government would have. So yeah, a lot of those types of things. Focus on fostering the success of, like Lindsay said, the success of individual farmers. Maybe second on the list too would be more of a communications thing too. I seem to notice this more often where in Ottawa, in conversations, as soon as agriculture comes up, people feel intimidated and feel unequipped to talk about agriculture, and they feel like that's a totally different world. And these are decision makers. These are deputy ministers. You could look at the Environment Committee, House of Commons Environment Committee met this week with Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault and some of his deputies speaking there. Some of the things, as soon as they were asked questions about the carbon price on carbon or carbon tax on farms, they weren't confident in their answers, and they weren't sure. You got the sense they weren't sure what they were talking about. And that seems to be a theme lately, where agriculture just doesn't get the respect it deserves. And so I don't know if there's a way that, so I maybe have two requests: and focus on public goods and make sure it gets the respect it deserves in Ottawa.
Yeah. I've thought about this, as I've been asking people about this over the past number of weeks, and I think it's focus on creating an environment for this industry or others to thrive, instead of being like a participant, or instead of being like, I think a lot of times what we're doing is we're trying to, and this isn't just a slight at the federal government, this is, I think, our industry in general. There's a lot of looking towards the federal government to solve the problems, more so than there should be at times. We don't need to create another puppet show like with just different puppets and different strings. We really need to government needs to be a catalyst and create the environment to attract people into the country, to allow the industry to really thrive. But we've also, from an industry standpoint, we got to have the drive to want to accomplish that. And I think that's also another issue. But I think there's all three of these very, very, very much connect. So if anybody has, I can tell some of the emails we're going to get, because every time I ask any question, I get the same thing. But go ahead.
There's also a self-reflection aspect to this too, that I think there's a chicken and egg issue here. Government tells us that they can solve all our problems, and then we expect and go to government for them to solve all our problems. So
100%.
That's broad brushing it, oversimplifying it in a big way. But in many ways, like you say, Sean, some of this falls on industry to also to take these risks and take chances and be more entrepreneurial and those types of things.
We are far too risk adverse. I fundamentally believe that in this country, and I hope that changes. And what can we do to change and create more entrepreneurial spirit? That's a whole nother show. That was audio from the Real Ag Radio podcast on Friday. So I'm curious, what would be your thought on that question? What would you say? Constructive stuff. I don't want, you don't need to get into the politics of this. This is a serious question. And I think an important one, because it's easy to point out, and I do this, where you point out, here's what you're doing wrong, but it's what would you do to actually create the change that you feel would really, really spark a difference, and spark that difference to unleash the industry in ways that we necessarily maybe haven't seen before. And in some cases, it could be a tweak. And in other cases, I think as you consider some of the possibilities here, we're talking about transformational sort of things. So think about that question. What would be your suggestion? What would be your ask for the chief bureaucrat? It's the Deputy Minister of Agriculture, Stephanie Beck. She runs the ship. She works hand in hand with the minister to lead the department. What would you ask them to do? And you heard some of my comments there. I really believe it is acting like a catalyst. It's setting the stage, teeing up the industry to hit that driver and really launch itself in that 340-yard drive, if you want to use that metaphor, so to speak, to take the industry to places that hasn't gone before. It's not about having the government solve our problems. It's about opening up the laneways so that private industry can really thrive and do great things as individuals in Canada. Send me your thoughts. S. Haney at RealAgriculture.com. We're going to hear from Ann Wasko of the Gateway Livestock Exchange right after this. Get all the information you need to keep your pulse crop healthy and profitable with the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School is a free YouTube video series covering agronomy, research, and more across a host of different pulse crops. It's also available as an audio podcast wherever you download or stream your favorite podcast. Check us out on YouTube or visit RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School, brought to you by BASF Canada.
The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is your one-stop shop for everything a canola grower needs. Check out our free video series on YouTube for all the latest in canola agronomy, research, marketing, and more. Don't have time to watch? Download the podcast version of the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com or anywhere you download your podcasts. Stay on top of all things canola with the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com, brought to you by BASF and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Since about 2010, I have been talking to Ann Wasko of the Gateway Livestock Exchange every 2 weeks about what's going on in the cattle markets. We call it the Beef Market Update. You can find it in the archive of all of our great discussions by going to RealAgriculture.com. On Friday, Ann and I did a new edition of the show, and lots happening right now in the beef markets in Canada and the U.S. Here's our discussion. Ann, how are we doing?
I am great today, Sean. Thanks.
Well, it's because it's raining again. Is that
It's
what?
raining again. It's crazy.
What a
Good.
reversal! You think about where we, and we're not perfect, but where we are today in a good swath of, especially in the dry, the real dry area, where we are today versus where we were 60 days ago versus last year, the year before. Wow, what a turnaround!
What a turnaround. And in terms of timing, when you're talking particularly from a cattle producer, grass, in terms of getting that moisture in time for the grass and the hay, we're ticking all the boxes. This is great.
Yeah. How does that adjust plans, or what are some of the considerations the rancher's going through right now?
Well, coming into the year, we were still hearing lots about, the drought concerns. And of course, the moisture through the winter was sketchy. And so that was, the back of everyone's mind, am I going to have to once again make changes in terms of marketing early or this or that? So for the first time in a long time, it feels like we're back to normal. Yeah, we can just run the cattle we're going to run, and we'll deal with it this fall. So yeah, no, things are feeling good. It kind of feels like this is the first normal year in a long time.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Well, very well deserved. There's been a lot of adversity trying to fight through some of the dry conditions. So, hey, update on the cash markets. What's happened this week?
Okay, well, a good week again in the U.S. And remember, this is our going into the U.S. long weekend, the Memorial Day weekend coming up here. So a solid week in the South, Texas and Kansas, they were up $1 again. So 187. Sean, that's going to be the highest price fed cattle prices in the U.S. since March. So, we took that big dip after the first news around AI, and now markets are slowly working their way back. In the north, so that Nebraska area, $2 higher live, 192, and on the dress side, 2 to 4 higher, 302 to 304 delivered dress. So a good solid market as we head into the long weekend for the U.S. Now on the cutout side, we did have a smaller kill last week. It was under 600,000. This week will be back up just over. But those things kind of shorted the beef supply a little bit, and we saw that cutout come up last week. Now this week, the cutout's kind of stalled. It looks like the buyers, retail buyers have determined we've got enough to get through the long weekend. Let's see what happens. So the choice cutout closed last night just below a week ago, 309.85. The select is about $10 back. Again, I think retailers are going to watch, see how trade goes this weekend to see how much do they step back into the market for Father's Day, kind of the next big beef weekend, if you will. So I would suggest that markets are kind of playing out as I would have expected. The other news from the U.S. that we'll have later today is their May 1 cattle on feed report. And the expectations going into this afternoon is smaller April placements, larger April marketings. There was a couple of extra days in April, if you're wondering why was it bigger. And so the on-feed number for May 1st, we're hoping will finally drop below a year ago. Maybe only 0.5%, maybe 1%, but it'll be the first time in a while where we're finally seeing U.S. cattle on-feed numbers drop below a year ago. In Canada, here in Western Canada, we've been 2% below a year ago for a bit now. So it'll be good, I think, even kind of mentally to get that number back below a year ago that we've been watching for. The one last thing I did want to mention on the U.S., Sean, was steer carcass weights continue to climb. Normally at this time of year, weights are coming down. And so they've been going up. Last week's weight in the U.S. was 923. That's 32 pounds over last year. And again, it's that classic. We're putting pounds on for a lot less dollars. The cost of gain is less than the dollars, the value of the cattle. So the economics make sense. We've said all along that we know this is the condition for 24 and we're going to put more weight on cattle. And that's exactly what cattle feeders are doing. So we'll watch that one. Kind of flip it to, let's take it back into Western Canada here. Pretty much a steady week in terms of where the fed cattle traded this week in Alberta. 432 to 433 delivered dressed was the market. It didn't feel quite as, there wasn't as much activity, not as quite as many cattle at the high end of the range. So last week, if you recall, the average in Alberta was 260. That was an all-time high for the Canfax weekly average. We might not get there this week. It'll be close, but maybe we look back and say last week was the all-time high for the spring. But again, we're not done yet. Carcass weights in Canada, we did get a little more current here in Western Canada. Our weights 2 weeks ago down to 903 for steers. So that's only 12 pounds over a year ago, so in a little better shape. I think the Western Canadian cattle feeder got more current than his American comrade. Our basis got so strong. We know when we've got strong basis here, it can be pretty fickle. So you better sell when you've got those opportunities. And so I do think cattle feeders sold into this market. So we're going to, if you're an Alberta cattle feeder, for the most part, I think you're going to go into June really current. The industry is going to be super current as we head into what I still expect to be the summer doldrums.
And when you are current like this at this time of the year, it does it adds some flexibility to what the business plan can be going forward to finish out the year.
Yeah, bargaining position, bargaining power, leverage. So lots of things we talk about in terms of where you sit from a marketing perspective. And then, of course, that helps making the plans down the road. You know, we've got these pens that, you know, now we can kind of plan in terms of how we're going to fill those pens going forward. Yeah.
Memorial Day weekend this weekend, coming off Victoria Day long weekend in Canada. So we're kind of in this very, very good grilling period of the year. Demand. Let's talk about that, because a lot of focus on beef prices, and you know we've been talking. Oh, it feels like 4 years about you know how high can beef prices go, and will the consumer continue to support beef as a source of protein? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, it is. And I think there's no question. Yes, beef prices at the counter are higher for sure. We talked about, I think, that on the show 2 weeks ago, Sean. The last data that came out from StatsCan actually showed March's prices coming down from where we were in Feb. So we'll see what the April prices look like. But bottom line is, when you're measuring demand, it's not just measuring that price at the counter. It's how much beef is being sold at the value of that product. And so, and CattleFax just talked about this again this past week on one of their webinars, that demand continues to be very solid for the first part of 24. Yes, it's not 21 and 22, but so far, third best year in history. So again, prices are higher, but there's less beef to sell as we go forward. And that's really what we got to remember, what we're talking about when we measure demand. So demand is still certainly holding together very well through the spring of 24.
It's good because of the supply. We need it, right? We could not afford a demand clip here. We need to continue to be strong in this area for sure, domestically and internationally.
Yeah, we need that. Of course, if you're a cattle feeder, in terms of profitability, where we're sitting now at these record high prices, you need that to be able to turn some profits. So we need, if we're going to keep the industry profitable going forward here, we're going to need to keep prices solid all the way through.
Hey, let's finish up cow market. What have you been saying?
Another great week. It's going to get quiet in the auction markets for feeder cattle and calves. But the slaughter cow market, very solid. Last week, Canfax reported another record high for D2 slaughter cows in Alberta, 185. That's $37 a hundred higher than this time last year. So crazy. And I'll tell you, Sean, I don't think it's over yet, because typically last year the highs were made in June for cows. I think we still got more room ahead.
Very interesting. Hey, and thanks so much for joining us here this week on the Beef Market Update. All the best to you, and enjoy riding that horse in that tall grass.
I will, and have fun on a long weekend, Sean.
Yeah, wait till we get some heat.
Oh, you'll hear it growing from there.
That is Ann Wasko of the Gateway Livestock Exchange. True friend, fantastic cattle analyst. Love our discussions. And, of course, you can find all those great talks by going to RealAgriculture.com. We've got more coming up here on Real Ag on the Weekend. When we come back, we're going to talk about herbicide layering and how that is one of the tactics, one of the tools when we're trying to combat herbicide resistance. You're listening to Real Ag on the Weekend, of course, here on 650 CKOM, 980 CJME.
I'm Lindsay Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomists, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomists with me, Lindsay Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin, host of the Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com. Throughout the year, on the Soybean School, we'll bring you timely agronomic video content from planting to harvest, from the latest agronomic research to the latest in production technology. Check out our massive video library on YouTube, RealAgriculture.com, or download the audio podcast versions wherever you get your podcasts. The Soybean School is brought to you by BASF and Syngenta Canada.
At RealAgriculture.com, we do a great number of Pulse School episodes. Well, we do crop schools, and Pulse is one of the crops that we cover. You can find episodes by going to pulseschool.com or at the Real Agriculture YouTube channel. And recently we had a discussion with Sean McKnight. He's with BASF Canada. And we talked about herbicide layering. Here's that discussion.
I'm Nick Syke, and today I found myself in Calgary at BASF talking to Shaun McKnight. We got into the ins and outs of herbicide stacking. Really interesting conversation. Let's get right into it.
So basically, herbicide layering is utilizing multiple herbicide passes to manage difficult weeds on your farm.
Okay. And what does that look like in terms of technicality for a farmer? They're loading up different tanks and going over it once at a time?
Yeah, so for instance, you might be talking about multiple passes in a season. That's basically what you're going to do with herbicide layering. So, in the springtime, you'd probably be using hopefully a residual herbicide if you can, and then you're going to plan your in-crop application and perhaps maybe even a post-harvest depending on how hard the weed is to control. And, realistically, your plan is based around your toughest driver weed is what I would say. So maybe it's wild oats for you, it might be cleavers, it might be kochia, but whatever the most difficult to control weed is for you, that's probably what you're going to build your layering program around.
Okay. So practically speaking, how is this different in philosophy or difference in strategy from straight tank mixing, say?
In reality, it's really not. So tank mixing is for sure a part of your herbicide layering strategy. So, in the spring, let's just use wild oats, for instance. You're growing a pulse crop. You might be using a group 15 mixed with glyphosate in the spring and another burn down herbicide probably. And so hopefully you limit that wild oats population for your in-crop application, which, because it's pulses, is probably a 2 and a 1 mixed together. So, we do have multiple modes of action there as long as we have no resistance. And then in the fall, you might be also tank mixing more herbicides. So, you have 3 herbicide applications there, and hopefully, if you can, you're actually tank mixing different modes of action as well.
So tank mixing in there while doing the layering.
While doing the layering, right?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So that's quite technical. There's a lot of different chemistries there to consider. How does this typically fit into a weed management strategy? Like, how do you see this implemented on farms in this area?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, first of all, depending on the crop, you may only have certain herbicide options, and so that kind of limits the available chemistries that you can have. So, the idea is that it fits in, as best as you can. You're going to rotate as many modes of action and chemistries that you can, and it also builds into your other crop years. So, specifically talking about pulses, we want to do a really good job of controlling a weed like kochia in years that we can use, products other than group 2s, right? So that's super important. So it's kind of a multi-year strategy, and we want to layer in as many herbicides as we can.
Well, that makes sense. Does this reduce selection pressure substantially?
So every time you apply a herbicide, you're going to have selection pressure. So that's the honest truth. But what you do is you kind of eliminate the stacking up of selection pressures, perhaps. So let's use Edge or a Group 15, for instance. So you apply that in the spring. Hopefully you lower the population of weeds that will emerge for your in-crop application of wild oats, for instance, and so you're going to try and eliminate the amount of stacking up of different selection pressures. So, if you're just planning on one in-crop application to control those wild oats, then you have your one selection pressure there, and you might stack those up year over year, whereas with a layering program, hopefully you're not going to, continually select with one chemistry. You're going to kind of multiply those applications across different groups.
So as much as possible, we're giving a particular group a bit of a break there.
For sure. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is it more important or difficult in pulse crops specifically than in other types? Is there a favorability here?
Yeah, so it's kind of both, right? Like pulse crops, especially when we're talking lentils, right? We're kind of tied to the Group 2 chemistries in crop. Peas as well. Maybe we have products that we can use Group 6s there too. But with pulse crops, it's for sure important as well as difficult. So we got to find different products we can use in the spring, residual herbicides, hopefully to limit the amount of weeds that we have, putting selection pressure on that in-crop herbicide. So for sure, it's probably more important in pulse crops and also more difficult in certain respects as well, just because of the limited amount of chemistries we have to work with. So yeah.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. So talking about the benefits there, I think we understand that we're giving each group a bit of a bump there in its potential to be effective long term. Mm-hmm. What are some of the drawbacks to using multiple modes of action at one time?
So, good question. I don't know that there's necessarily any drawbacks, but I think the key point would be is that if you're using, you could use your multiple mode of action product, and if you're using it one time every year to control that specific driver weed, the drawback there would be that we're just having that one selection pressure event year over year, as I mentioned before, stacking it all together. So there really is, the drawbacks there would be that we have that one application. So when it comes to the layering program, we do want to be mixing in multiple modes of action where we can, but we also want to stack up those applications to continually control that specific weed we're worried about.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Is there any hesitation that you see in the industry about adopting herbicide layering, or is it something that you're seeing quite a bit of success with, something that's adopted by farmers right away?
Yeah, I think it's being adopted by growers. We see there's been a huge uptick in fall residual herbicides and pulse crops, for instance, especially. And so, growers there are going after kochia, most likely. They're putting in a Group 15 for kochia and wild oats and that type of thing. I would say that the biggest drawback to get people to sign on board is most likely has a lot to do with the costs involved, for sure. But I think, there's a lot of benefits. So, Chris Willenberg has done a lot of research at the U of S and showing that we actually see some yield bumps with specific crops, canola specifically with some of the work that they did, but we did see, yield increases when we do a layering program. And so that might not be something as a grower that you see specifically because you're applying a herbicide across your entire field, right? But we are seeing yield bumps there too. So, hopefully the cost isn't a total concern for growers, but we are seeing a pretty big uptick in what we'd consider layering programs for sure.
Well, I suppose the inverse side to the cost is that it's very tough to calculate the cost of resistance with a full group of herbicides, right? So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's for sure a cost to resistance, and whether it's yield losses because of competition due to those weeds, or maybe it's even harvest losses in terms of we have weed seeds in the crop that we're trying to sell, so we're getting dockage reductions, that type of thing. So there's for sure a cost to resistance. So if we spend a little bit more money up front in a herbicide program, hopefully we can maybe outweigh those costs that are there.
Thanks for joining us here today for RealAg on the Weekend. I'm your host, Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture.com, and you've been listening to this show on 980 CGME and 650 CKOM.